So for more on this, I'm going to turn to welcome Trey Walk and Kate English for our warning side segment. Kate English is the executive director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights. Trey Walk is a researcher and advocate at Human Rights Watch's U.S. program. They are both members of the R2L Coalition, which is, as I mentioned, composed of advocates and researchers who are worried about the current state of our democracy. So typically, the discussion of human rights is seen as existing out there, right? Somewhere else, not here in the United States. And this is particularly, of course, frustrating, given that it's so critical to see racial justice in America through a human rights framework. Now, this is something that Black civil rights leaders have long advocated for. Let's not forget the petitions from the National Negro Congress, the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois to the United Nations immediately after its inception in 1945, all demanding accountability for human rights violations happening here, ranging from enslavement, Jim Crow laws, lynching, the suppression of political participation. It goes on and on. For leaders like this, civil rights have always been seen as human rights. So I'm looking forward to our next guest who will help us understand why what is happening to American democracy is a human rights crisis. So I want to come to you first, Trey. So what does the international human rights framework have to say about these anti-woke censorship bills, the war on public education that is transpiring in the United States today?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Crenshaw, for having me. It's an honor to be here tonight and to be a part of the Right to Learn Coalition and the Freedom to Learn Network and to support this work. And I want to pick up right where you left off, because I think the point about this long tradition of Black civil rights leaders and Black radical leaders who are fighting for racial justice using the international system is something I want to kind of just start by framing this conversation with. I am disheartened by the fact, but I think it is a fact that the international human rights system is in a moment of real crisis. A lot of people's faith in the system is very low, and it's built on this kind of critique that's been there from the beginning, which is this idea that when people think about human rights, they think about it as something elsewhere, but they also think about it as something that is a tool that's mostly used by white countries, by Western countries, by wealthier countries to condemn or to go after those bad people in the Black and brown countries over there who are doing the real atrocities. And us over here, we protect human rights, and those people over there, they violate human rights. And I think that has never been true. And we know from our ancestors and our movement leaders that that's not true. And so I gain a lot of inspiration from folks like the history you just named, the NAACP, getting stuck at advocacy within the United States and realizing, okay, well, if the United States wants to position itself as a world leader, we need to expose to the world how that's not true in order to put pressure on the US to actually live up to its commitments. The NAACP writes its appeal to the world in 1947 and sends it to the United Nations. Paul Robeson and other Black scholars write the We Charge Genocide document in 1951. And this idea was to put pressure on the United States, and it worked. There were other countries, particularly the Soviet Union at the time, that said, okay, well, United States, if y'all are going to be the leaders of freedom and democracy and human rights in the world, how are you lynching Black people in your streets? How are you having this police brutality or this racial apartheid system? And so this sort of appeal to the international community is something that's a tool that's always been there for us, and I think we need to tap back into it. And as we'll see on the next slide, I just want to maybe share a couple of things that are concrete in international human rights law that we can be thinking about as a movement. So one thing that I think folks don't know, if you aren't steeped in the system, is that when the United States signs one of these international human rights law conventions, it is a treaty, and so it has the force of federal law in the United States when the United States ratifies these treaties. And so one of these is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the right that's being violated, all of our rights that are being violated, is a right to receive information. And the Human Rights Committee talks about how countries can't restrict people's right to expression, and especially in a way that's targeted in a discriminatory way, which is exactly what's happening right now. The states are targeting people who do not share their preferred ideology, who do not share their preferred political views, and are targeting certain communities. And so that's a right that's obviously being violated under international law, and the United States is failing to uphold its human rights obligations. One other sort of tool that I would like to show, it's on the next slide for us, is the International Covenant on Ending Racial Discrimination. The United States actually ratified 30 years ago in 1994. And this one really goes right to the heart of the issue around Black studies, critical race theory. And you can see the language there. It says that countries who signed this, so the United States signed this and said, we agree with all the other countries that we should be doing this. We should educate the public about the importance of special measures aimed at remedying historical discrimination. That's teaching young people about why systemic racism exists. That's teaching young people about affirmative action. It's teaching them about historical racial injustices. And so these are the very things that are being taken away from us right now. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to know the specific laws, the specific provisions that are being violated, because what the United States is doing right now is in violation of international law.
Thank you for that, Trey. You know, it is so important to remind us, to remind ourselves that what we're expecting, demanding, fighting for, you know, isn't just, you know, some preferences. It's not just our own story. These are rights that are protected and recognized in the international community. So it's incredibly helpful to be able to have this language and to recognize that, you know, this is part of a larger, broader, wider conceptualization of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a human protected by rights, and to have that language to be able to articulate it. I want to come back to you in a second because, you know, there is a question about why there has been such a separation between human rights and civil rights in the American consciousness, and of course what we, you know, are pressed to do about it now. But Kate, I want to come to you as an expert educator on atrocities, in particular atrocity prevention education. What does it have to tell us about some of the historic and global warning signs that are unfolding right here in the United States?
So first of all, I want to thank you so much, Kimberly, for being here. And I speak for educators across the United States when I just share our admiration for your work and appreciation for your research. And I want to also emphasize that the Educators Institute for Human Rights starts with the word educators because we are about teachers working with teachers. So when we are working internationally, we're not talking about working with major NGOs or international organizations. We're talking about working directly with teachers on the ground, people who know what happens in a classroom, and we all understand and can speak the same language. And it's so important to include teachers' voices in all of these conversations. But the main thing that we want to focus on is that these atrocities are not inevitable. And I don't believe that, we're sounding an alarm because we're seeing the warning signs that have led to atrocity in the past, but it doesn't mean that they have to right now. There are places where we can intervene, we can look at those warning signs, and we can stop things before they happen. And as you'll see in the next slide, internationally and historically, there are places where we could have intervened and recognized these warning signs. So for example, we see this book called The Poisonous Mushroom, which was produced by the Nazis as a way for young children, we're talking like pre-K through grade 5, to learn how to identify Jews and see how bad they are. And also you'll note that there's a hyperlink here. We have a short PowerPoint slide if anyone would like to look at it later, just a reminder of what propaganda is, what it means, and some examples. But it's so important to recognize that propaganda is a part of this, the scapegoating, the division between people in the same country. And we certainly are seeing deep division right now. And I think that's the thing that causes me great concern, is the depth of the division that we're seeing right now. We also see that there are past conflicts. We see that happen. They're like the lead up. So in the Holocaust, we saw pogroms across Europe, and they're isolated and they're one village at a time. We see the same thing in Rwanda. We see isolated attacks against Tutsis in different villages. And even in Ukraine, we have tended to forget that in 2014, the Russians took Crimea, and they directly attacked Ukraine. And it was a precursor to what we're seeing happening now there. Mm-hmm. Preparations that we see, this is a photograph from Rwanda in 1994, and you can see the collection of machetes, and that was a major implement of genocide in that event. We're seeing preparations here in the United States, and I would also point out that I was in Rwanda 3 weeks ago and was asked by a television interviewer about, we only have 2 hours a week to teach about the genocide in Rwanda. And I looked at him and said, oh my gosh, you get 2 hours a week? We get nothing. Across the country, we do not get to talk about our dark past. Teachers are not required to talk about our history in any meaningful way. If it happens because individual districts or individual teachers take the action to make sure that accurate history is being taught. Now, the last piece of the warning signs historically and internationally is that it often happens under the umbrella of a wider conflict. So the photograph that you see here is of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this particularly is a photograph from Sarajevo. So we see that there's this major war going on as the former Yugoslavia is dissolving. And within that, camouflaged by that, masked by that, we see that there are atrocities happening that are ethnically motivated. So these 4 things are major warning signs internationally and historically.
Mm-hmm. And so as you give us a sense of the international and historical ones, I'm sure that there are people who will nod their heads and they'll say, yes, yes, saw that in Bosnia. Yes, saw that, in other places, but that doesn't have anything to do with the United States. That's not us. What do you say to those people who say, not here, not us, not now?
I would say that there are plenty of warning signs here and now, and that will show up in the next slide. We can see that we see that deep division that I mentioned before. We see it on Facebook. So you can see that 2016, we're seeing the white nationalists. But as we looked at that poisonous mushroom book, we're also seeing that educational materials, not just the curriculum and not just people storming school boards, which are horrible in and of themselves, but there are actual materials that are being endorsed in 4 states, including Florida and Arizona. I know Florida's awful. I want to give a shout out to Arizona as well, where they need help. That we see this PragerU video that's part of, not just out there, but part of the curriculum for these states. And in this particular video that we've captured the image of, this is Christopher Columbus telling us that slavery is not so bad. And so we are minimizing the experience of American citizens who have stayed here throughout the worst of it and still want to be Americans, which is the thing that amazes me. And we're going to belittle that in what we teach to children through these materials. We see that past group violence happening in Charlottesville, and it's racially motivated, and it's anti-Semitic, and it's just hateful. And we see death and destruction happening even in that site, just because we want to take down a monument that elevates a Civil War, let's say the word, a traitor, a person who did not want to be a part of our country anymore. And we want to take that monument down, and this is the result. The preparations that we see here are, maybe they're not machetes, but you can see there's a young child at the Iowa State Fair, and they are preparing these children for this idea of Project 2025, this idea of turning over everything. All of the civil servants in the United States who have been there for decades and know how to, I don't know, just the basic stuff, how you get, a budget report into a different agency. But they're everyday workers, and we want to wipe them out. just for starters, not to mention the fact that we want to turn over the entire US Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And finally, I recognize that technically speaking, we would think of January 6th as another example of past group violence, except that we're hearing a major candidate for the United States presidency saying that if he loses the next election, we will not have the United States anymore.
He's saying the quiet part out loud.
I don't even think he's quiet about it anymore. I think he's just saying it out loud. So those are the warning signs that we're seeing. And again, I want to emphasize, it's not inevitable. We have a choice. We can take action. We can intervene. And teachers have a big role in that intervention.
Which is precisely why teachers are in the crosshairs.
Yes.
So Trey, let me come back to you. We just have one more minute here. It is not inevitable. And we recognize it's not impossible either to happen here. But one of the challenges is to connect the history we do have to the threat that we're facing. Precisely, the fact that many of the atrocities and the denial of democracy has happened in this country through the framing of white supremacy, through the idea that this country is not meant for everybody, but just for some people. What are some of the challenges to confronting that history and some of the challenges to linking the human rights framework that seems to be out there and the racial justice framework that seems to be in here? It seems like these separations are actually mutually reinforcing. So what are they and how can we bring them together?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what we're doing tonight is a big part of that. And I want to just start by sharing one quick story. I'm at Human Rights Watch. We're working on a report right now that documents some of the harms of these educational censorship laws and sort of maps out the lack of robust federal response to these harms. And I've been spending the last few months talking to a lot of Black students and educators and parents. And I was talking to this one teacher. His name's Isaiah, and he lives in South Florida. And he's so inspiring. He wanted to be a teacher from when he was in high school, and he went to Florida A&M, HBCU there, and he studied history, and now he's back in the high school. He's teaching civics and U.S. history, and he talks about how he views his job is to teach his students to think critically about the world, to question the government, to question where it fails. He does these really amazing activities where he has his students look at the local city budget and they create their own version of it, or they create voters' guides for their parents. And it's this beautiful sort of melding of Black history, Black studies, civics, where he believes that the work he's living in the tradition of the freedom schools, where it was inextricably linked that democracy and Black history and Black studies, they all went together. So when they opened the freedom schools, they were teaching you about W.B. Du Bois and sort of Black thought, but they were also teaching you what your county commissioner does. And I think about Isaiah a lot and how he's under attack in Florida right now, but also the fact that not a lot of students in this country get that sort of education, and human rights law lays out a framework for us to ask for more than what we have. So it's not enough to just get these bans off the books. We can actually be pushing for leadership to say every student in this country should have access to an ethnic studies curriculum. Every student should have access to a Black studies curriculum. And there are already 19 states where this is true, but you can imagine federal leadership and funding to really push us further and to go past what we had before. When we were in 2020, when we were in 2015 or 2005, people weren't getting what we want. And so we need to put our proactive agenda out there. And I'll just close by saying that, human rights don't have to be out there. Human rights are ours. We make them, we claim them. And I think our movement, and you'll see a kind of slide on the next slide. These are photos of people all across our country who are starting to do that now. They're claiming these rights and they're making them real and they're making them mean something. And I think that's the task that we have ahead of us this summer, in November, and moving beyond that.
Thank you so much, Trey. And thank you, Kate. Thank you both for laying out the groundwork for the urgency of human rights in the U.S. now, and how human rights activists can get involved in order to incorporate that framework to address this current crises.